Hey, I'm Nathaniel Fossen. I'm a professional archaeologist and I do most of my work in the eastern woodland region of the United States. I've been working and studying and occasionally teaching here for over 10 years, mostly dealing with the indigenous cultures that lived here prior to colonization by Europeans. Today I'm in the mood to really deal with Salt's Cave. If you've been following my channel for a while, you'll know that my research tends to focus on the use of caves and rock shelters in the southeastern United States. Salt's Cave in Kentucky is where American cave archaeology really came into its own in the 1960s. And I've talked about it a little bit before in some other videos, and you'll find links to those in the description. Now, Salt's Cave is part of the greater Mammoth Cave system, which is the biggest cave system in the world as far as we know. Hundreds of miles of interconnected underground passageways are carved out of karst limestone by flowing water, but all of the portions of the Mammoth Cave system, there's archaeology in a lot of them, but it was Salt's that really drew Watson's attention. Her book on the archaeology of Mammoth Cave is about 3/4 about Salt's Cave, actually. So, Salt's Cave gets its name from the mineral salts that drew people into the dark zone in the early woodland period. You may remember from previous videos that the dark zone is that space beyond the vestibule where no ambient light is available. So any exploration of this kind of space requires artificial light. So in this case, cane torches made out of river cane. And these kinds of cane torches have to have the ash knocked off the end of them every once in a while, kind of like ashing a cigarette. So we see those charred stoke marks on the walls of the cave still today. We know that that's what they were using because you can see the little cupule curvature of it. We also find the actual cane torches all over the place. Now, gypsum was one of those mineral salts that I've been talking about, and it comes in a couple of different forms. But at Salt's Cave, the main form was a sort of soft white crust that formed on the walls of certain cave chambers. It was knocked off the walls with stone hammers, and this stuff can be made into a very vibrant white pigment, especially if it's fired and burned. It can also be used to make a kind of a plaster. Selenite is a different form of gypsum that grows in the cave sediments as a crystal, and it can be mined out of the cave floor also. There's a different cave that's really confusingly called Indian Salt's Cave, also in Kentucky, where archaeologists found a selenite crystal inside a woven cloth bag. So that's proof positive that they were definitely collecting this material out of these caves. There are also things like gourd bowls and wood trays and other kinds of containers for collecting gypsum and transporting it out. I haven't really seen in any of the literature why this white paint substance was so important, but the amount of work that went into mining it makes it seem pretty significant for some reason or another. Between the food rations that have to be prepared, preparing the way with like checkpoints that have supplies like more cane torches and things, hauling in heavy tools to workstations, and then the actual mining work itself, it's all pretty labor intensive. It takes a lot of time. We're talking about days and days and days of prep work. So it might have had some sacramental function in the same way that wine is necessary for Christian sacraments or the macaw feathers are important in Mesoamerican religious practice. It might also have just had some sort of trade value outside in other regions beyond the cave. But that's really wandering into the world of speculation. It's fun to think about, but it's not science until you really have evidence for it. And as far as I know, we don't have that. Now, there are other salts that come out of Salt's Cave. Mirabilite and epsomite are other cave salts that are seasonally available based on kind of the ambient humidity within the cave. Epsomite's better known as Epsom salt, by the way. These two materials form in kind of a soft kind of tuft on the cave walls. It reminds me of cotton candy sometimes. And these fibrous forms are very, very sensitive to humidity. So they have to be either used on site or dissolved in water to be transported out of the cave. And once they hit that humid Kentucky air outside, they disappear, they dissolve. Both of these cave salts work as a laxative. If you eat it in small doses, it cleanses your system very, very quickly, within a few minutes. And we know that they were eating these mineral salts because it's in the human feces, the coprolites that I talked about in the Watson video. Now, there's a combination of features here that suggested to George Crothers that something more was going on in the caves than just gypsum mining for paints and plasters. Although the amount of gypsum that they removed from the walls tells us that clearly this was an important activity going on. So there are places in the cave that they couldn't reach, parts of the walls that were too high, that show us how thick the gypsum crust on the wall used to be, because there's no gypsum, and all of a sudden it just kind of, well, there's a bunch of gypsum up high, and then all of a sudden it stops when you get to the areas that people could reach. Now, like I said, something else is going on here in addition to that gypsum mining, though. The combination of sensory deprivation that you get inside the cave, combined with this purging of the digestive system that is facilitated by the mirabilite and the epsomite, provided really potent conditions for altered mental states or hallucinations. There are also, there's a demographic reason he's thinking along these lines too. There are two individuals who are naturally mummified by the cave environment. Both of them were men. In fact, one of them was a like a 9-year-old, 10-year-old boy. And he puts that together with the fact that all of the coprolites that have been tested for hormone levels show boosted testosterone. So it does really look like in the early woodland period, this cave was only really being used by men. And so Crothers thinks that it was being used as the setting for initiation rites, kind of rites of passage to bring boys into the community of adult men. And these kinds of vision quest initiation rites are attested all over the world ethnographically, so it's not a huge stretch to think that that might be what's going on here. Crothers also thinks that they were using maygrass from the Eastern Agricultural Complex to brew a sort of weak beer to help induce altered states even more. And the mining could have also been involved with that too. The kind of rhythmic pattern of knocking that gypsum off the wall could have combined with all of these other elements in order to induce these altered states. But just to be clear, there's no reason to believe that the mining and the initiation process represented the same event. They might have overlapped in some cases, but there's no reason to think that mining was exclusively done by young men who are doing vision quests. They could have been entirely different events altogether. And I can't really think of any way to provide evidence one way or the other. Like one of the mummies, the one that wasn't the 9-10-year-old boy, is an older man. I think he was supposed to have been in his 40s when he died. So he could have been in there just as a minor, but he also could have been there as one of the adults officiating the initiation. I personally think that's working a little bit too hard to try to make Salt's Cave associated exclusively with rites of passage. I wouldn't try to make that argument, but it is a possibility. Now, there's some other stuff that was found in Salt's Cave that's worth talking about, like the woven grass slippers. These have been found all over the cave. And the weird thing is that they're frequently just left behind in pairs, like the person who left them intended to come back and get them. It's not like they fell off. They were removed and set next to each other, on the floor of the cave together. They're also all the same size, but they're made to fit different foot sizes by wadding up other materials like, grasses or mosses or whatever, and stuffing those down in the toe of the shoe. And this suggests a couple of things. First, the people wearing the slippers aren't making them for themselves, and they're not being made specifically for the person wearing them. They were being mass produced as a standard size. And this suggests that the people who were making these slippers didn't really know who was going to be wearing them. And I also suspect that these weavers were women, because remember that in indigenous cultures, weaving is really closely associated with the women's community and not so much the men's community. Now, I've alluded to this before, but Watson didn't just kind of wander around the cave with her grad students mapping in where they've found bundles of torches and scorch marks on the walls and sandals and coprolites and all those kinds of things. She also excavated the vestibule. And The salts vestibule is kind of weird. It patterns very differently than what we would see at something like Dust Cave or Russell Cave. You don't enter salts from the side like you would at those caves. You get into salts by crawling in through a sinkhole in the vestibule ceiling. And so it's a low light environment from the very beginning as soon as you go in. And her excavations in the vestibule produced bones from things like game animals like deer and turkey that aren't found deeper in the cave. They also recovered celt axes and hoe blades and some bell-shaped pestles, the grinding tools that would have been useful either for grinding up the gypsum that was being mined or for preparing food rations that the miners would bring in with them. So incidentally, those rations would look familiar to hikers and campers and spelunkers today. Between Watson's excavations of the vestibule and the coprolite analysis, we have a good idea of what these people were bringing with them into the cave. Things like hickory nuts, sunflower seeds, grapes, berries, all pretty standard trail mix ingredients 3,000 years later. So this brings me back to those coprolites. The human feces that were recovered and analyzed tell us some very interesting things about the way that these people were living, specifically the food remains that were found in those coprolites. First, the pollen species that were identified suggest that people were entering the cave during the spring, and the actual physical parts of the plants that were recovered indicate that storable plant crops like quinoa pods and sunflowers were an important part of the diet by this point in the early woodland. And when you kind of aggregate all of these coprolite samples, the diversity in the diet is pretty high, but if you look at individual samples, the diversity is fairly low. The individual coprolite samples only have 2 or 3 plant species in each, so everyone's eating different meals, and each made with just a few ingredients. And this suggests something interesting about the social organization of these miners. These last meals that they ate before entering the cave were specific to the individual. They weren't sharing. They weren't eating big group meals. And in pre-industrial societies, a diverse diet with roughly homogeneous ingredient lists across individuals is what we expect for people living in villages, where food preparation is more of a community affair with multiple households kind of contributing. It cuts down both on preparation time and it cuts down on food waste for the communities that are cooking as a group. So shared meals are also good ways of reinforcing group solidarity. They build a sense of community that incipient villages need in order to hold themselves together. So what we see is the opposite of that pattern: low diversity meals, and everyone is eating individually, and well, at least before they enter the cave. And what that suggests is that even though these people are growing crops, they still haven't started living in villages yet, at least not during the late winter and early spring months when people were going into Salt's Cave. Now, take a second and think about what I just said, because it's absolutely insane. I just told you that Watson and her team figured out that despite the fact that they were definitely growing and storing crops, people in the early woodland period weren't living in villages yet because of the patterns that they saw in their excrement. Now, of course, that's not the only line of evidence for this claim anymore. Since Watson and her team published these conclusions in the 1970s, there's been a lot more work done outside the cave in the same kind of region. And we don't find concentrated village sites with higher populations and things in Western Appalachia that date to the early woodland period. We just don't see them. And that kind of thing doesn't really start to show up in the archaeological record until the onset of the Middle Woodland period a few centuries later, by which point the mining of these mineral salts seems to have stopped, at least as far as we can tell from the radiocarbon dates from all of those cane torches that have to be used to go into the dark zone. So if you put this video into context with what I talked about in the Alchemists of Memory video, you'll find that all of this is happening right in between the collapse of Poverty Point and kind of the waning years of the Shell Mound Archaic and the onset of the Hopewellian culture in the middle woodland period. So this whole video occupies that gap between two big, impressive, monumental activity centers that most people get distracted by. And this is what I mean when I say that archaeology is not about collecting shiny bullshit. We can do so much more when the job gets done right and we take those people and places that most people ignore and we take them seriously. Now, I hope you found this interesting. There are, of course, a lot more details and factoids about Salt's Cave that you can read about in the sources that I've cited down in the description. If you've got any questions, you can post those in the comments. And until next time, thank you for watching.